It was Mr. Libby who was convicted of lying, perjury, and obstruction of justice, and it's the President of the United States who's decided that he would commute his sentence, thereby raising the very real suspicion that he's participant in a cover-up and an ongoing obstruction of justice. They have been trying to make this about me from the very beginning, when in fact it's about them. It's about the lies they use to justify the war. It's about the betrayal of the national security and the leak of a covert CIA officer's identity to the press.
That was Joe Wilson, former CIA officer Valerie Plame's husband. Vice President Cheney's former aide, Scooter Libby, was, of course, spared by President Bush in the investigation into the leak of her identity. Well, Libby is said to be relaxing at home today. Democrats are far from relaxed. They are howling mad. Senator Dick Durbin said, quote, even Paris Hilton had to go to jail. While the other senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, stayed lofty as usual. He said the administration, quote, has consistently placed itself and its ideology above the law. Democratic lawmakers told angry voters to flood the White House phone bank. Can Democrats finally make these charges stick? Up until this point, the Libby drama was a long, at times convoluted trail that only the most ardent political junkies could or cared to follow. Now the Democrats will try and paint things more simply. President Bush let a criminal off the hook. Will that narrative stick? Here to tell us a man who has covered this from day one, MSNBC's David Shuster. David, welcome.
Good to be with you, Tucker.
So, Joe Wilson, I guess, is not going away. That was my one hope in all this, that Joe Wilson would just go to New Mexico and be quiet. He told Keith Olbermann that there is a quid pro quo involved here, that Libby had agreed to remain silent in exchange for a pardon or commutation. But it turns out, we learned today, that Scooter Libby had no idea that his sentence was about to be commuted.
Yeah, he had no idea. He had no idea. But think back to Pat's question in the last segment. Why now, and why the special intervention? And the way the president seemed to handle this, by not going into the Rose Garden, by doing this sort of secret statement, then by having a statement today where he takes one question. I mean, it fuels the idea that the White House did not want Scooter Libby to wake up this morning, one day after the appeals court said, no, you have to go to jail in 2 weeks. They did not want Scooter Libby to wake up and think, I haven't heard from the White House. Maybe I ought to make that phone call to prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald and suddenly tell him about the conversations with the vice president that I couldn't recall at the trial.
Okay, maybe, but wait a second. Let me ask a macro question here. All these shows, all these hyperventilating cable hosts, and I'm not going to name any names here, but we know some of them, who are all upset about Scooter Libby's duplicity. They don't seem to care that Joe Wilson is just a screaming, obvious, outed liar. Nobody cares. People keep having him on their shows. Like, you know what I mean?
It doesn't matter. I mean,
it doesn't matter.
Joe Wilson was not charged with lying to a grand jury.
I'm not saying he's committed a felony in lying. I'm just saying that since we're all so keenly interested in honesty for its own sake.
What's the Joe Wilson lie?
The Joe Wilson lie is Joe Wilson claimed that his wife had no role in sending him to Niger. And we know that that is totally false.
He did not say that. He did not say that his wife had no role. What he said...
He said she did not recommend him. We know that she did recommend him.
Well, the fact of the matter is, and that's been muffed by both sides. A lot of people said, oh, Joe Wilson claimed that Vice President Cheney sent him. And Joe Wilson never claimed that. What Joe Wilson said all along was that there was an effort by the Vice President to get the CIA to look in this raw piece of intelligence.
Right.
And the CIA turns to the person who happens to be an expert on this, Valerie Wilson, and says, hey, you know about this. And she says, oh, yeah, and by the way, my husband has experience in this part of Africa. Right. Maybe you should send him. Valerie Wilson peels off, and the CIA calls Joe Wilson, and that's the end of Valerie Wilson's involvement. Right. Now, that's a pretty straightforward narrative that both sides have gotten wrong, but that doesn't take away from the main point. The main point is that Joe Wilson comes back from Africa and tells the CIA there was no effort by Iraq to seek uranium from Niger. But still, that ended up in the President's State of the Union speech. And then in the spring, a few months later, there's the Vice President's office when Joe Wilson starts popping up in some of these columns, and they decide, we're going to hit back. And they call the State Department, say, get some information. And they call the CIA, get some information. And the Vice President gives Scooter Libby some information. The investigation begins when Joe Wilson is outed, and Scooter Libby says, oh, no, I learned about this from reporters. Come on.
Wow. That was, I sort of lost the point of the question, but that was an able recounting of some of the basic facts of the case. And since you are an expert on the basic facts of the case, I'd be interested to know what you make of Harry Reid's description of what exactly we've witnessed over these past 24 hours. Here's what he said. The president's decision to commute Mr. Libby's sentence is disgraceful, huffed Harry Reid. Libby's conviction was the one faint glimmer of accountability for the White House efforts to manipulate intelligence and silence critics of the Iraq War. Now, even that small bit of justice has been undone. So, in other words, Harry Reid sees Scooter Libby's conviction on perjury and obstruction of justice charges as justice having to do with the Iraq War?
Well, look, if
what the hell is that? We don't send people to prison for crimes they're not accused of committing.
I will grant you that if there's one thing that will end this dead in its tracks, that will end this political controversy, would be the idiocy of the Democrats with some of the statements they're making out. If the Democrats, though, instead of making these highfalutin comments about the Iraq War and the intelligence, could simply say, you know what, the Republicans are the party of law and order, and there's the president engaged in cronyism, taking care of a friend, that would seem to me
wait a second. I mean, let's be totally real here. Bush comes out with a statement and says he did it. He lied. His lying undoes this system we hold sacred, our justice system. That's bad. But the punishment was too strong. What's wrong with that? That's not,
because,
you know what I mean? That's not undoing, do you know what I mean?
Because when the president says, and when Tony Snow says the punishment was excessive, you look at the case and you look at these issues were argued, and the judge said, no, 30 months is not excessive. You've got a parole board that said 16 months. But the judge, a Republican judge appointed by President Bush to the bench.
We went through this yesterday. The fact that he's Republican, David Souter's a Republican. I mean, so what?
But if you have respect for the judiciary, why do you have respect just for the jury?
I don't have respect for every decision that every judge makes. Judges screw it up. I don't have respect for the OJ jury either. What the hell are you talking about?
That's fine.
Because someone's a judge or a
the president should come out and say, you know what, I respect the jury, but I don't respect this judge. Even though I appointed him, I don't respect him. He was wrong.
Respect his
Why doesn't the president say that?
No, he says, I think it was excessive. And in fact, we just had Tim Noah, the noted right-winger, pointing out that this sentence, 30 months, is twice the recommendation of the parole board.
Well, everyone who's sitting in prison who says that their prison sentence was excessive, do they now get to weigh in and ask President Bush and say, hey, my judge said that it was...
You know what? I think, as I brought up in the first segment of the show, I think that's a very fair point. I think there are a lot of people who are serving...
At what point do we go outside the boundaries of the justice system? Because if somebody can weigh in and say, oh, well, the judge was wrong, and the appellate court was wrong, and the prosecutor was wrong, and the jury was wrong, at what point do we say to those people in prison, oh, but no, you have to live with the sentence?
He isn't saying that. He's just merely saying the sentence was too long.
Right.
And I think I'm coming very close to convincing you, David, but unfortunately we have a commercial break, something you know a lot about. David Shuster, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tucker. Always a pleasure.
Speed Talk.